Welcome back to Ghostly Gist of Ghosts, where we delve into the darkest corners of reality. Tonight, we're bringing you 3 spine-chilling tales that took place in the seemingly innocent setting of motels. These stories will make you think twice before checking in for the night. So, grab a blanket, turn off the lights, and prepare yourself for some true, terrifying motel horror stories. Story 1: The Unseen Guest. Jack had been driving for hours. The sun had long set, leaving the highway bathed in the cold glow of his headlights. Fatigue weighed on him, and when he saw a small, neon-lit sign that read Motel, he decided to call it a night. The motel was a single-story building, with faded paint and a barely visible name. It looked deserted. Jack was too tired to care. Parked his car and walked into the lobby. The receptionist was an elderly man who barely looked up from his newspaper as Jack requested a room. The man slid a key across the counter without a word, his eyes never leaving the paper. Jack noticed a strange odor in the air, but he shrugged it off, attributing it to the age of the building. Room 6 was at the end of a dimly lit corridor. The door creaked loudly as Jack pushed it open, revealing a small, sparsely furnished room. A single bed, a dresser, and a TV on a rickety stand were all it had to offer. The carpet was worn, and the wallpaper was peeling in places. Jack tossed his bag on the bed and collapsed beside it, too tired to bother with the TV or even a shower. As he lay there staring at the ceiling, didn't shake the feeling that something was off. The room was quiet, too quiet, kind of silence that makes your ears ring. Jack tried to ignore it, closing his eyes and willing himself to sleep. But just as he was drifting off, he heard it, a soft, rhythmic sound. Breathing. His eyes snapped open, and he held his breath, listening intently. Breathing continued, coming from somewhere near the foot of the bed. Jack sat up slowly, his heart pounding in his chest. He strained his eyes in the darkness, trying to see if anyone was there, but the room appeared empty. He reached for the lamp on the nightstand and switched it on. The warm light filled the room, but there was no one in sight. Breathing had stopped. He felt foolish. It had to be his imagination, a trick of the mind brought on by exhaustion. Jack lay back down, keeping the light on this time. But sleep wouldn't come. Every time he closed his eyes, he could feel that presence again, watching him. The sense of being observed grew stronger until it was almost unbearable. He sat up again, his eyes darting around the room. There was nothing, just the worn furniture and his own reflection in the mirror. Then, the footsteps started. Soft at first, almost imperceptible. They came from the far corner of the room, near the dresser. Jack's blood ran cold as he listened to the sound of bare feet slowly crossing the floor. They moved deliberately, one step at a time, as if whoever, or whatever, was making them wanted to be heard. Jack couldn't move. He was paralyzed with fear, his eyes locked on the spot where the footsteps seemed to be coming from. The steps grew louder, closer, until they were right next to the bed. Then, they stopped. He didn't dare breathe. His heart pounded in his ears, drowning out all other sound. The silence stretched on, oppressive and suffocating. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Jack mustered the courage to reach for the lamp again. His hand trembled as he flicked it off, plunging the room into darkness. Footsteps didn't return that night. Jack didn't sleep. He lay awake until the first light of dawn crept through the small window. As soon as it was bright enough, he packed his things and left the room, not bothering to shower or eat. When he handed the key back to the receptionist, the old man finally looked up. "You slept in room 6? He asked, voice hoarse. Jack nodded, too shaken to speak. The old man's eyes narrowed, and he leaned in closer. "You're lucky you're leaving in one piece. Not everyone who stays in that room does." Jack didn't ask what he meant. He didn't want to know. He just wanted to get as far away from that motel as possible. As he drove down the highway, couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him in the rearview mirror, waiting for him to return. Story 2: The Blood-Stained Carpet. Sarah and Mike had been driving for hours in the pouring rain. The storm had come out of nowhere, turning the road into a treacherous path of slick asphalt and blinding sheets of water. They were on their way to a friend's wedding, but with the storm growing worse by the minute, they knew they couldn't make it in time. Mike squinted through the windshield, searching for any sign of a place to stop. Finally, they spotted a flickering neon sign that read, Motel. It was old and barely visible in the rain, but it was a haven compared to the perilous drive. Mike pulled into the parking lot, and they hurried inside, drenched from head to toe. The lobby was small and dimly lit, the musty smell that made Sarah wrinkle her nose. The receptionist, a middle-aged woman with dark circles under her eyes, barely acknowledged them as she handed over the key to room 12. They thanked her and made their way down the narrow hallway, the sound of the rain pounding on the roof growing fainter with each step. The room was unremarkable, faded wallpaper and a bed that looked like it hadn't been changed in weeks. But it was dry, and that was all they cared about. As Mike set their bags down, Sarah noticed something strange near the bed. "Mike, look at this," she said, pointing to a dark stain on the carpet. Mike walked over and peered down at it. The stain was large, almost black, and looked like it had soaked deep into the fibers of the carpet. It gave off a faint metallic smell that made Sarah's stomach turn. "Probably just an old wine spill or something," Mike said, shrugging it off. These places aren't exactly known for their cleanliness. But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to it. She knelt down to get a closer look. The stain wasn't just dark. It was almost sticky, like something had congealed there. She pulled back, feeling a wave of nausea wash over her. "That's not wine," she whispered. Mike frowned, but before he could say anything, there was a loud clap of thunder outside. The storm was raging, and they both knew there was no point in trying to leave now. They decided to get some rest and deal with the stain in the morning. But sleep didn't come easily for Sarah. She kept thinking about the stain, the way it seemed to almost pulse in the dim light of the room. When she finally drifted off, her dreams were filled with images as if someone screaming, a shadowy figure standing over them with a knife, blood pooling on the floor. She woke up several times, her heart racing, the sound of the storm echoing in her ears. Each time she awoke, she swore the stain had grown larger. By the early hours of the morning, it had spread across the carpet, inching closer to the bed. Sarah couldn't take it anymore. She shook Mike awake. "Mike, we need to leave. Something's not right," she insisted. Mike groggily sat up, blinking at her in confusion. But when he saw the look on her face, he didn't argue. They quickly packed their things and hurried out of the room, eager to leave the motel behind. At the front desk, Sarah hesitated before asking the receptionist about the stain. The woman looked up from her magazine, her expression unreadable. "What room were you in?" she asked. "Room 12, Sarah replied, her voice shaky. The receptionist's face paled and she looked away, set as if considering whether or not to tell them the truth. "A few years ago, there was an incident in that room," she finally said. "A woman was murdered there, stabbed to death by her husband. No matter how many times we clean the carpet, the bloodstains keep coming back." Sarah felt a cold shiver run down her spine. She grabbed Mike's arm and they left without another word, the receptionist's words echoing in her mind. As they drove away, Sarah couldn't help but glance back at the motel. She swore she could still smell that faint metallic scent clinging to her clothes, a reminder of the blood that refused to fade. Story 3. The Room with No Escape. Claire was exhausted. She had spent the entire day in back-to-back meetings, her head buzzing with numbers and projections. By the time she pulled into the small motel on the outskirts of town, all she wanted was a hot shower and a good night's sleep. The motel was nondescript, with a flickering sign that read vacancy. It wasn't anything special, but it was close, and that was all that mattered. The receptionist was a young man who barely looked up from his phone as he handed her the key to room 7. Claire mumbled a thank you and made her way to her room, too tired to care about the peeling wallpaper and the slightly musty smell in the hallway. The room itself was small and plain, with a bed, a dresser, and a small TV. There were no windows. Claire didn't mind. She just wanted to get some rest. After a quick shower, she climbed into bed and closed her eyes, letting the exhaustion take over. She slept deeply, her dreams a jumbled mess of work deadlines and unfinished tasks. When she finally woke up, the room was still dark. She glanced at the clock on the nightstand. 7 a.m. She had slept through the night, but something felt off. The air in the room was thick, almost suffocating. She got up and walked over to the door, ready to start her day. But when she turned the handle, the door wouldn't budge. Claire frowned and tried again, twisting the handle with more force. But it was no use. The door was stuck. Panic began to creep in as she realized that she was trapped. She pounded on the door, shouting for help, but there was no response. The hallway outside was silent. She grabbed her phone, but there was no signal. No Wi-Fi either. It was as if the room was cut off from the outside world. Claire tried to stay calm, telling herself that it was just a glitch. Someone would come by soon. But as the minutes ticked by, her anxiety grew. The room felt smaller and smaller, the walls closing in on her. She paced back and forth, her heart racing. She banged on the door again, harder this time, but it didn't budge. The silence was deafening, broken only by the sound of the clock ticking on the wall. Hours passed, and Claire felt herself slipping into despair. She had tried everything, pushing, pulling, kicking the door, but nothing worked. She was trapped in this tiny, windowless room with no way out. The air was getting thicker, harder to breathe. She slumped against the wall, tears of frustration and fear streaming down her face. Then she started to hear the voices. At first, they were faint, just whispers on the edge of her hearing. But as the minutes passed, they grew louder, more insistent. They were calling her name, mocking her, telling her she would never leave. She covered her ears, trying to block them out, but they only grew louder. The clock on the wall seemed to tick faster and faster, the sound drilling into her skull. Claire felt like she was losing her mind. She screamed, pounding on the walls, begging for someone to help her. But the voices just laughed. Cruel, echoing sound that filled the room. Just when she thought she couldn't take it anymore, the door suddenly swung open. Claire stumbled out into the hallway, gasping for air. She looked around, expecting to see someone, anyone. The motel was eerily deserted. The hallway was empty, and the lobby was dark. Claire ran to the front desk, her heart pounding in her chest. There was no one there. She was alone. She ran outside, desperate to get away from the motel, to get back to her car and leave this nightmare behind. But as she reached the parking lot, she saw someone, a cleaning lady, sweeping the sidewalk. Claire rushed over to her, babbling about the door and the voices, but the woman just stared at her. Confusion etched on her face. "This motel has been closed for years," the woman said slowly, her brow furrowed. "You're the first person I've seen here in a long time." Claire felt the blood drain from her face. She looked back at the motel, its dark windows staring back at her like empty eyes. She didn't know what had happened, and she didn't care. All she knew was that she had to get away, as far away as possible. She ran to her car and drove off without looking back. But no matter how far she drove, she couldn't shake the feeling that the motel wasn't done with her. That somehow, someway, she would find herself back in that room again, with the door locked and the voices waiting to welcome her back.